Hello and welcome to Armor of God Apologetics. I'm your host Wayne Harsha. Please recall that this is a series that I've been doing for Victory Outreach Tacoma, and we are going to continue our series in apologetics here tonight. Now, in addition, you can understand that because I'm doing this for my church, in order for them or even any of the YouTube viewers to interact, you can also get to us through Zoom using the Zoom app. You just download the Zoom app, join a meeting, enter the meeting ID, which you see there, and then join the meeting. That way you can actually video interact with us as well. Now, as you know, if you're watching on YouTube, obviously we're streaming live on YouTube, and you can see that right here. So, with that, let's get started on our class today. Now, remember that last week we talked about what's called inductive arguments. And inductive arguments are those that are based on an accumulation of evidence that lead to a probable conclusion. Unlike a deductive argument where you go from two or more premises to a conclusion that absolutely must follow if premise A and premise B are true. An inductive argument is not like that. So there are no premises. It's more an accumulation of evidence that leads to a probable conclusion. Now, another way of putting it is it is the inference to the best explanation. Now, there are a couple of examples of inference to the best explanation type arguments when it comes to arguments for God and Christianity, and one of them I talked a little bit about last week is the minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus, which Gary Habermas and Mike Licona are famous for. But the other one is one that we will actually be talking about tonight, and that is the teleological argument for God's existence. Now, remember, even from the first class that we had a couple weeks ago, that all beliefs begin with some sort of claim, some sort of truth claim. And right now we're in week 2 of the truth claim that God exists. And there are many Bible verses, of course, that claim the existence of God. In fact, the entire Bible is God's Word, and therefore our claim is that God exists. And that's what we're trying to show right now in terms of our apologetics. And so each of these claims then needs a reason or many reasons. And last week we talked about the cosmological argument for God. This week we'll be talking about the teleological argument for God's existence. Now, these reasons in this case are what we call theistic arguments, or arguments for the existence of God. It means the same thing. And so last week, again, we talked about 2 different cosmological arguments. And the first one was the argument simply that the origin had the universe had a creator, that all contingent beings, the universe being a contingent being, have to have an explanation. And that contingent being's explanation can either be another contingent being, or it can be what is known as a necessary being. And a necessary being in this case is God. In other words, there's no possibility that that being doesn't exist. And so that goes right along with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, we also talked about, last week, we also talked about the Kalam cosmological argument. And the Kalam cosmological argument is a very simple argument, and it simply goes, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And this seems quite intuitive, and we went over the evidence for this, and we talked about the fact that there is incredible scientific evidence to indicate that the universe began to exist and therefore had a cause, and we call that cause God. And the attributes of that cause we talked about last week is that it's extraordinarily powerful, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and personal, and those are attributes of God. So that's how the Kalam cosmological argument argues for the existence of God. But today we're going to be talking about the teleological argument. Now, the teleological argument has an extraordinary amount of information in it, and it can get extraordinarily technical. What is the teleological argument? Well, the teleological argument for God's existence comes from the Greek word telos, which means goal or purpose. And in modern day apologetics, many people will discuss this as arguments from design. And there are actually many of them, and we'll go through quite a few of them tonight. So let's start talking about what all that entails. The teleological argument entails evidence from the universe itself and how finely tuned the universe is, to the privileged status that our planet and the details of how our planet indicate that it was designed to be that way, designed for life, to life itself and DNA and human life and the information contained in DNA, as well as in single cell organisms, and in fact even at the subcellular level with something called irreducible complexity in things like the bacterial flagellum, which you see on my screen right now. Very famous astronomer at Cambridge University, a guy by the name of Fred Hoyle, who originally started as an agnostic, made the quote, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. And this, in part, is what brought him to at least deism, if not theism. So let's start talking about some of the fine-tuning of the universe. And in order to talk about that, we need to introduce one concept, and that is that there are four fundamental forces in the universe. And those four fundamental forces are gravity, electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. Now, you don't necessarily need to know exactly what those are. Obviously, pretty much everybody knows what gravity is. But what's important to remember is simply that those are four fundamental forces in the universe, and they are part of what hold the universe together the way that it is. And so let's take a look at just the ratio of two of those forces, and that is the ratio of gravity to the electromagnetic force. Now, if it were to change, if that ratio were to change by just 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, there would be no large or small stars. Think about how important that is. If there were no large or small stars, there would be no sun, there would be no earth, there would be no life, there would be nothing to even be talking about. Just to give you a visual example of what 1 part in 10 to the 40th power looks like, this is 10 to the 40th power written out in longhand. And to give you an understanding of just how difficult how small 1 part in 10 to the 40th power is. Let's imagine if we took the entire North American continent that you see there, and we took a normal silver dollar, Susan B. Anthony silver dollar, and we said, we're going to not just put 1 down, but we're going to coat the entire North American continent with silver dollars. Now, not only are we going to coat it, that still doesn't get close to 10 to the 40th power. We're going to actually start stacking silver dollars on the North American continent. And we're going to take one of them and we're going to paint it red. And then we're going to place it in the stack. And we're going to take that stack level, not like you see it here, but level, and we're going to stack it all the way to the moon. Okay? So just wrap your head around that. That is 1 part in 10 to the 40th power. And we're going to ask our friend Susie, blindfolded, to pick out our red coin. That, her chances of picking that out would be 1 in 10 to the 40th power. Just to give you an example of how extraordinarily fine-tuned the ratio of gravity to the electromagnetic force actually is. Now, let's move on to just talking about gravity for just a moment. Gravity, there is the gravitational constant written right there. Again, it's not important to remember the numbers, just so you can see it written out. If gravity itself, if the gravitational constant was varied by simply 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, life would not exist. To give you an example of how big 10 to the 60th power is, our human bodies, the average human body contains 10 to the 14th power of cells. Okay? You're talking orders of magnitude larger. 10 to the 60th power, our body contains 10 to the 14th number of cells. It's an infinitely different size of number. 1 part in 10 to the 60th, 1 in 10 to the 60th parts is this written out in longhand. Again, an extraordinarily huge number. And just so you understand, if gravitational constant were different, we would not have a universe. Either it would have collapsed down on itself, or it would have expanded so rapidly that we would not have had the formation of galaxies, stars, solar systems, or planets. We would not exist if gravitational constant was varied by just 1 part in 10 to the 60th power. What about the expansion rate of the universe? Now, that's not one of the 4 fundamental forces, but you can see there the capital G, that's the gravitational constant. But you also see there that lambda. Lambda is what's called the cosmological constant. And let's look at that cosmological constant. If cosmological constant were changed by 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, okay? Now we're beyond 10 to the 60th. We're at 10 to the 120th power. The universe would not exist. In fact, Professor Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, said if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, that's that 10 to the 120th power, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size. So you can see now just how important even the cosmological constant's fine-tuning is. Just that one constant. Lee Smolin, another theoretical physicist, said one time, perhaps before going further, we should ask, how probable is it that a universe created by randomly choosing the parameters would even contain stars? The answer in round numbers comes to about 1 chance in 10 to the 229th power. That is 1 part in 10 to the 229th power. Just look at that. That's even mind-boggling in terms of the U.S. debt, okay? It is orders of magnitude higher than, we can't even conceive of a number that high, but I'll try to help you here. If you remember back to your days in chemistry, every atom has protons, electrons, and neutrons. If you took all the proteins in all the atoms in the entire universe, and you made each one of those proteins into its own unique universe with different properties, you would never get a universe that contained stars statistically. That just goes to show you just exactly how phenomenal the number is. 10 to the 229th power. It is beyond astronomical, pun intended. In fact, Paul Davies, who is also a world-renowned physicist at Arizona State, said the cliche that life is balanced on a knife's edge is a staggering understatement. In this case, no knife in the universe could have an edge nearly that fine. So let's look at the fine-tuning just of the universe, and let's think about what that could result from. Well, there are three things, and really only three things. They cover pretty much all options that I can even possibly come up with, and that is necessity, chance, or design. So obviously the universe does not have to exist in the manner that it does. Again, you could have a universe that just doesn't have stars. So for instance, if the gravitational constant were different, or the cosmological constant were different and varied by even a small amount, you could have a different universe. It wouldn't contain life, but you could have it. So therefore, it is not out of necessity. So what about chance? Well, we just looked at some of those options in terms of chance. And while some of you and many ardent atheists would be using this Dumb and Dumber quote, so you're telling me there's still a chance, the reality is chance is just not a reasonable option in terms of the fine-tuning of the universe. What about design? Well, because fine-tuning is not a result of necessity and it's not a result of chance, then it's a result of design. And if it is a result of design, the data are a result of the design, which we said, but also that implies a designer. Let's move on to a slightly smaller scale and talk about this Earth and how finely tuned we are on the planet Earth in order to have life. Now, many have called our planet a Goldilocks planet in that it is in so many ways just right and so balanced for the continuation of carbon-based life forms. So let's talk about the privileged planet. And why do I call it that? Well, there's an awesome book out there written by two scientists, Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards, called The Privileged Planet. I would recommend it to everyone. There is a video in the Teleological Argument series, a playlist here on the Armor of God Apologetics channel, and I'll also link it in the description below so that you can see that, done by Dr. Jay Richards. It's an awesome video. It really brings all of this to a point. First of all, what they found is that in order for a planet to have life, it needs to be in a spiral galaxy. Perhaps you remember way back in grade school or high school, perhaps when you were studying astronomy as part of your science class. There are different types of galaxies. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, happens to be a spiral galaxy. And lo and behold, a spiral galaxy is what you need to sustain life. Now, not only that, the placement of a planet that is to sustain life must be in a very specific area. If you recall, there are spiral arms to a spiral galaxy, and then there are spaces between those spiral arms. Well, as you can see here on this slide, our planet and our solar system are placed in that inter-arm gap. Why is that important? Well, if it were in one of the arms, there would be too much cosmic radiation and background and gravity and things of that sort, and it simply would not allow for life. So we have to be balanced in between spiral arms in a spiral galaxy, and we are. Now, furthermore, there's a lot of important things that have to do with the sun. The sun, of course, is a star. First of all, it cannot, and this is where some of the Goldilocks terminology comes in, it cannot be too big. The reason it can't be too big or too early, if it were too big, it would make our planet too hot. The temperature, heat extreme would be too high, and we couldn't have sustained life. Water would all evaporate into the atmosphere, and we would have no liquid water, which is important for life. If it were too young of a star, it would be burning and sending out too much in the way of heavy metal radiation, which would bombard our planet and not be life-sustaining. It also can't be too small or too old. Obviously, if it's too small, then our planet would be too cold. All the water on the planet would freeze, and therefore, again, we wouldn't have liquid water and wouldn't be life-sustaining. Furthermore, if the sun were too old, it wouldn't be giving off enough heat. Stars eventually burn out. They only have a certain amount of energy. We talked about that last week. And as they burn out, it would make the planet too cold. And so we have a star that is not too big, not too small, not too hot, not too cold. Like Goldilocks said, it was just right. Well, what about our solar system? Well, it turns out our solar system is actually extraordinarily important for us too, and specifically two planets, Jupiter and Saturn. Why are they important? Well, they're important for two main reasons. Reason number one, see how large they are compared to the size of Earth. They actually help stabilize Earth's orbit around the sun by their gravitational pull, thereby keeping us from getting too close to the sun. But perhaps more importantly, those planets are so large and have such a big gravitational pull that they help the planet Earth from getting too much in the way of cosmic or interstellar debris in terms of meteorites or comets. And so the planets Jupiter and Saturn are extremely important in terms of helping the Earth keep from being bombarded by intercosmic and interstellar debris. So very, very important in terms of our solar system. But how about our moon? Well, it turns out our moon is also extremely important. Our moon, for those of you who don't know, is actually very large in terms of the size compared to the Earth itself. And in fact, that size is actually extremely important for us. Why is that size important for us? Well, it does two things for us. Number one, it stabilizes the Earth's axis of tilt. If the Earth didn't have that proper axis of tilt, and if it were more upright, that axis of tilt around which we rotate, we would have too much in the way of temperature extremes from hot to cold, and that would be extraordinarily important for us in terms of sustaining life. Furthermore, it also, as you probably know, stabilizes our tides, and our tides are important in certain marine life and other types of life on Earth. The other thing is, by stabilizing the axis of rotation, it keeps us from wobbling out of control in our rotation and in our orbit. So the moon, extremely important to us. It turns out our gravity here on Earth, many people know, of course, that if you go to the moon, you weigh less, and that's because the gravity on the moon is less. The gravity on Earth is extremely important for maintaining life, and in fact, if it were changed by just 1 part in 10,000 billion, then there would be no life on planet Earth. It would not sustain life. So obviously you can see just exactly how important and how finely tuned Earth is for sustaining life. It's extraordinarily important. Let's move on now and talk about life and how the teleological argument is based in large part on life and some of the things life has to tell us about God the Creator. In order to talk about life, we need to talk a little bit about the origin of life and how life actually started on Earth. Now, materialists, and naturalists, those are people who believe that all there is the material world. There is no supernatural, there is no God. So by definition, they are atheists. They believe that amino acids ultimately came to be formed, and those amino acids then folded in certain ways and joined together and became proteins, which then became single cell organisms, multiple cell organisms, and ultimately on to humans. Now, that being said, it is a little crazy to think about the phrase, which is from the goo to you via the zoo. But that's what materialists actually believe in, and that's just simply kind of a strange thing to think about. And I'll tell you why. I'll give you some examples of why here in just a moment. The other option, of course, is that life was begun by the hand of God, and that, of course, is what Christians believe. Now, in order to talk about how life came into being, let's just pause for a moment and answer the question, well, what is life? And in order to ask that question, you could also ask, well, are amino acids life? Okay, again, that's what naturalists believe started the universe in terms of life, started life on planet Earth, and it ultimately came into being all the way to humans through evolution. But the reality is that amino acids aren't life. So let's look at what is perhaps the simplest single-cell life form on Earth, and that is the Mycoplasma bacteria. Now, Mycoplasma bacteria is not just a clump of amino acids. No, quite the contrary. It has DNA, it has cytoplasm, it has a 3-layer cellular membrane, it has soluble proteins in it, it has ribosomes in it, and it has soluble RNA in it. And you'll find out here in a moment why that's all important. They're all necessary for life. So you can see that simple amino acids are not life. Now, atheists will oftentimes point to something called the Miller-Urey experiment. This was an experiment about 66 years ago where these two chemists were trying to look at could they create life in a test tube. And what they did was they took very highly concentrated, very pure chemicals that they believed were in the original cosmic goo of the early planet Earth. They put in water, they heated it all because they felt that everything was very hot back then, and then they put an electrical charge to it. And lo and behold, they came up with some amino acids. Very simple ones, I might point out to you. And you can see there on the screen that amino acids are not all created equal. Some of them are much simpler than others, but they were able to create amino acids. That's it. Just amino acids. But basically, if you were to listen to people talk about this experiment, you would think that it was like Dr. Frankenstein bringing the monster to life. And that just simply is not the case. They created only amino acids. But it turns out the Miller-Urey experiments has been debunked many, many years ago for many, many reasons. First of all, the gaseous environment, the chemicals that were there, the concentrations of the chemicals that were there, all of those different things simply have been found by subsequent science not to be the case for the early environment of the Earth. And so the entire Miller-Urey experiment has actually been debunked. So let's go back to looking at just a single cell organism, and I want to just show you just how incredibly complicated and complex and sophisticated even single cell organisms are. So if you look at a single cell organism that has a nucleus, so one step up from mycoplasma, it's going to have DNA. It's going to have mRNA, M stands for messenger, and then it's going to have a way of taking that mRNA and using one of these compounds right here, making a strand of amino acids, and that strand of amino acids then folds and becomes proteins, which is one of the main things that cells actually do. So in a slightly more simplified form, you take double-stranded DNA, and then through a process called transcription, it becomes RNA. And then through a process called translation, it becomes linked amino acids or a protein. The problem is this is an extremely simplified version of what it actually looks like. In fact, even just proteins don't just look like a strand. They start like that, but then they fold and become have a secondary structure to them. And then they fold even more and they become a tertiary structure, and they fold even more and become a quaternary structure. And most proteins don't have any function until you hit this, the quaternary function or quaternary structure phase. So extremely, extremely important. In fact, even when you're in the primary structure phase, if one of these amino acids is substituted by another amino acid, the protein doesn't fold correctly, and it doesn't have any kind of function whatsoever in the cell. Now I want to add something in here. Remember how I said transcription is the moving of DNA to RNA, and then translation is RNA to what here is labeled a polypeptide. A polypeptide is the same thing as meaning a long chain of amino acids or a protein. Well, you see here we've added in the green blob, which is RNA polymerase. It is an enzyme. The other one is a ribosome. Well, you might ask the question, what is RNA polymerase? It's an enzyme. What's an enzyme? It's an enzyme. An enzyme is a protein that catalyzes or makes faster different chemical processes within the cell. So maybe you're starting to see the problem here. In order to go from DNA to RNA, you need proteins, but you need RNA to make proteins. So there's step number one that's a problem. What's a ribosome? Well, a ribosome are organelles composed of proteins as well as RNA. Remember, ribosomes is what takes you from RNA to proteins. So you need RNA and proteins in order to go from RNA to protein. You need proteins in order to go from DNA to RNA. In order to go to proteins, wait. Maybe I'm missing something. No, actually I'm not. The problem is, in order to have life and a replicating cell, you need DNA, RNA, and proteins all in the same place at the same time. Now, it doesn't just go for making proteins, okay? Understand that it also goes for the replication of DNA itself, right? So even if somehow amino acids could have hooked together and become DNA, you still have the problem of how do you replicate DNA? DNA is useless unless you can replicate it and make it another cell. Well, the replication of DNA requires all of these things: topoisomerase, helicase, primase, ligase, and several others. Well, what are those? They're enzymes. Again, what are enzymes? Enzymes are proteins. Furthermore, you have to have an RNA primer. So in order to build another strand of DNA for a cell to replicate, you need both proteins and RNA. So that begs the question of, well, how in the world did you get the first life if you had to have all of those things not only in the same area, but all in a cell? Again, you could have them floating out in space, but if they're not in a cell, they're not life. And that just shows you how extraordinarily complex this is. And in fact, if you really look at it, DNA relies on RNA for its replication. RNA relies on DNA because DNA actually codes for the RNA. DNA relies on proteins in order to replicate itself, in order to make RNA, all of those kinds of things. But in order to get a protein, guess what codes it? DNA. Also, in the same manner, you need proteins to get from DNA to RNA, RNA to proteins, but you got to have proteins there to get RNA, and you got to have RNA to get the protein. So in other words, this is what we call an irreducibly complex system. You have to have all of them present, functioning at the same time, in the same place, in order for you to get life. So extremely, extremely important in this case. So that leads Dr. James Tour, who is a nanoscientist, to say molecules do not care about life. Nobody has ever seen molecules assemble toward life. Molecules do not move toward life. Nothing has changed in the origin of life science in the last 66 years. What is he saying? He's saying that since the Miller-Urey experiment 66 years ago, nobody has even come close to producing life in a test tube. And guess what? Even if a scientist, stop and think about this now, even if a scientist was able to produce life in a test tube, does that prove that life began with no intelligent design? And the answer is absolutely not. Because what has designed that experiment? Intelligent life. An intelligent designer designed the experiment, showing that even if you get life in a test tube in an experimental way, it still takes intelligent design in order to get that life. And in fact, that leads Dr. Michael Behe, who is a biochemist, to say, in private, many scientists admit that science has no explanation for the beginning of life. Darwin never imagined the exquisitely profound complexity that exists even at the most basic levels of life. Let's move on now, and let's just talk a little bit about the language of DNA. And you may say, well, why is that important? You'll see in just a moment. Languages, all languages, have two things in common. The first is that they transmit information, like the Rosetta Stone, right? If we didn't have the Rosetta Stone, we would not be able to decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. But because we have it, because it gives us information, it transmits information of what each of these languages means compared to the other, we have ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Well, the question then becomes, does DNA transmit information? First of all, let's look again at DNA. Just so we're clear, the DNA that is contained in an amoeba, a single cell organism, is the exact same DNA that is contained in humans. It is no different. There are 4 different types of nucleotides with a backbone. The 4 nucleotides are A, T, G, and C. And it is no different. The amount is slightly different, but it is no different in its structure or composition. And you see, even in a single cell organism like an amoeba, it contains as much information as 1,000 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. In fact, if you stretch out the DNA in a human cell, a single human cell, end to end, the amount of DNA in a single human cell would stretch almost 3 feet in length. And if you looked at the amount of information in the DNA in just one human cell, it is the same as the amount of information it would fill 8,000 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, again, does DNA transmit information? Well, yes, and it does it in a highly incredible and highly precise manner using, again, that 4-letter code like you see written out here, CTAAA, GAT, GAT. That information is so complex that at one time it was thought that huge expanses of it were just quote-unquote nonsense DNA, meaning it didn't actually code for certain proteins or certain molecules within the cell. Rather, it was just kind of a placeholder. Well, it turns out even science today has shown that most of that nonsense DNA actually has function in terms of regulating genes up and down and signaling to start the production of a protein, things like that. In fact, the information that is transmitted in DNA is so complex that that DNA contains all the information needed for each and every cell in the human body to differentiate into all of the other types of cells. Think about it like this. One simple skin cell on the end of your finger still contains all of the DNA in your entire genome. That DNA has the information that coded for your brain cells, for your muscle cells, for your organs, for your heart, for your eyes, for your skeleton, for your spinal cord. That's how much information the DNA in every single cell in our body has. It codes for all of our cellular processing, including things like proteins and carbohydrates and fat metabolism and all the processes that our bodies have. And it codes the information not only how those cells can replicate, but when they should replicate. And if you think even that is simple, it's not. Understand, things like nerve cells, they replicate at extraordinarily slow rates compared to, say, the lining in our gut or our skin. So every cell in our body contains DNA that has the information to code for all of that. The other thing that all language has in common that it is produced by an intelligent design. In fact, Frank Turek, who's actually a lawyer but an apologist, he wrote the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. He loves to use this analogy. He said, you would never come downstairs and go to pour a bowl of your favorite alphabet soup and see spelled out there, Travis, take out the trash. And in a million years, you would never think that that box just spilled and spelled that out. Rather, you would understand that mom tipped the box over, pulled out some of the letters in the alphabet's cereal, and spelled out, Travis, take out the trash. Okay? It is produced by an intelligent design. Our brains have no problem looking at that and saying that came from a designer. That did not just fall into place. Furthermore, if you were walking down the street and you saw a flyer on the street and it advertised a party tonight, you would never in a million years think that the ink on the page just magically appeared where it needed to appear in order to tell you there's a party tonight at such and such address at 7 p.m. It's just no one in their right mind would think that. I'll even take it one step further. If you're walking down that same city street and you look down at the sidewalk and you see Shakespeare's tragedies, Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, and Hamlet, you would never, ever, ever believe that the ink just magically appeared in order of those classics. Furthermore, you wouldn't even assume that 1,000 chimpanzees pecking away for 1,000 years on 1,000 computers would ever come up with one of these books either. It doesn't just take intelligence, it takes a certain type of intelligence to put forward information in language. So the question then becomes, is DNA produced by intelligent design? Well, perhaps I'll let Bill Gates answer that when he said DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. Now I ask you, if a Windows computer tells you that there's the Windows company and Bill Gates behind it, how much more, given what Bill Gates just said about the complexity of DNA, does DNA point towards a creator God? I ask you that question. This, by the way, is spelled out in an excellent book written by a guy named Stephen C. Meyer, who actually lives and works in Seattle. That book is called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. It is an excellent book. One of his videos, actually a couple of his videos, will be linked in the description below. And I will also put that on the Teleological Argument playlist on Armor of God Apologetics so that you can take it on and take a look at it. Let's move on to a concept called irreducible complexity. This book was written in 1996 by Dr. Michael Behe. I quoted him earlier. When he was talking about the fact that many scientists even indicate that there's no evidence for origin of life. They can't explain origin of life. And he started looking at some of the Darwinian evolutionary theory, and he started realizing that it just didn't make sense in certain ways. And he came up with this term, irreducible complexity. Now it sounds very very fancy, but in reality what he really is saying is there are certain things in this world that are complex, and complex to the point that they cannot be reduced to any less than that. He uses the mousetrap as an example. The mousetrap is a perfect example. It has 5 parts: a base, a catch, a hammer, a spring, and a holding bar. Well, if you take any one of those parts and not just take them out, but make them not function well, that mousetrap will not work as a mousetrap. It might work as a paperweight, but it's not going to work as a mousetrap. And so that is an irreducibly complex system. In other words, it needs all of its parts put together and functioning properly at the same place at the same time in order to have any function. So if you lose the catch, you lose all the function. Okay? Pretty simple. Well, it turns out that the same thing is true of more complex things like a watch. If you look at all of those sprockets in a watch, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that a watch implies a watchmaker, right? None of us would think that that watch just came into being. And furthermore, if you take any one of those sprockets out of that watch, guess what? The watch doesn't work. So mechanical watches like that are irreducibly complex systems, just like a mousetrap. Well, it turns out there's a lot of those in life. And one of them that is an incredible example of this is in single cell organisms. And that is something called the bacterial flagellum. The bacterial flagellum is how many bacteria, the most common of which is E. coli, actually swim its way through media like water in order to get to its food sources like sugar. Okay, think of it kind of like the tail on a sperm cell, but it's even more complex than that. And if you look at these motors, they are the most highly tuned motors ever discovered. These motors can actually turn at 100,000 revolutions per minute, and within 1/4 turn stop and reverse direction and spin at 100,000 revolutions per minute the other direction to change the direction of the bacterial flagellum and the E. coli bacteria. And they're made up of all of these parts: this hook or universal joint, inner and outer membranes, the studs, C-rings, the rotor, the inner membrane, the bushings, and the filament. And it turns out that if you take any one of those, not only does the bacterial flagellum not work well, it actually just doesn't work at all. So in other words, this completely refutes Darwinism. Understand, naturalists believe that not only did we go from the goo to you via the zoo, that it happened by random, minor, small changes over time. This is an example of how that cannot be possible. Because without all of the functioning parts of a bacterial flagellum, you don't get movement. If you don't get movement, the bacteria sits there. It cannot get any nutrients. If it cannot get nutrients, it dies, and it does not pass along its genetics. So this is an example of irreducible complexity. Before you think this is the only one, understand, in humans, the human eye is an example of irreducible complexity. Okay? But it's not just human eyes. It's also all of these biochemical pathways. These are the biochemical pathways within the human body that help us with all of our metabolic processes. And you have to understand that if any of these goes wrong, it doesn't just put a little hitch in the system. If it doesn't kill the individual, which it oftentimes does, it causes what's called inborn errors of metabolism, and those cause terrible syndromes that oftentimes result in children dying either in embryo stage or very early in life, within the first couple of years of life. So these are all, not all of them, many of these processes are examples of irreducible complexity. If they didn't have all the enzymes and all the parts in place, in the same place, at the same time, fully functioning, they just simply wouldn't work. And so there are a myriad of irreducibly complex systems within life. And it's interesting because atheists will oftentimes say in response to that, well, oh, the bacterial flagellum has been debunked as a irreducibly complex system. First of all, I don't actually believe that based on the science I've read. But second of all, even if atheists were able to debunk one irreducibly complex system, it doesn't mean that they've debunked all irreducibly complex systems, which is what you would have to do to debunk the concept of irreducible complexity. So, what is the inference to the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe and of our planet Earth and of life? Well, I'll give you 2 Bible verses. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. Psalm 19, 1 and 2. And the other is, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Romans 1, 19 and 20. And with that, I will open it up to any questions.
A prep installation, and then if it's tile like that, a lot of people want to have it grouted. I'm sure the situation,
Does anybody have any questions for me from Victory Outreach on Zoom?
Unmute me. Hi, I got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I heard something that troubled me.
Sure.
You said that the theory of irreducible complexity disproves Darwin. Could you be more specific about which thing Darwin it disproves? Because Darwin, he had the theory of evolution.
Correct.
And you're saying that doesn't exist?
So first of all, you always have to understand, if somebody asks you, do you believe in evolution, you have to ask them one question first. What do you mean by evolution? Okay?
Yeah.
Here's why I say that. There are 2 types of evolution: microevolution, macroevolution. Okay? Mm-hmm. Microevolution is absolutely a true fact. It is. There's no doubt about it. Microevolution, for instance, is why when there were certain moths, for instance, in England, that when it became very polluted with coal, burning coal, what they saw was that the moths became darker in color. Okay, that's microevolution. That is small changes within the genetic code of a species. Okay. Another example in animal or in humans is the sickle cell disease trait. Believe it or not, sickle cell, which is most common in African descent people, is actually beneficial in terms of protecting against malaria. If you have malaria, yeah. if you live in an area of malaria, basically you can't get it if you have sickle cell. So guess what? People who had sickle cell became very prominent in those regions. That's microevolution. I want to make this next part extraordinarily clear. There is no convincing evidence that macroevolution, in other words, an amoeba became a multicell organism, which became a more complex one, which became reptiles, which became birds, which became us. There is zero convincing evidence to macroevolution. None. Zero. Zip. Nada. None. I can't make it more clear. That is how bad Darwinian evolution was actually when it looked at it. And in fact, many of the things you've seen in textbook and I've seen in textbooks And some of Darwin's actual examples of evolution have been completely debunked. An example, one of the things he used in the Galapagos was the beak of that certain finch. I don't remember what the name of the finch was.
Uh-huh.
But he used the length and the thickness of the beak as an example of macroevolution. Well, it turns out scientists since then have actually gone back to the Galapagos and they've actually studied those birds. And it turns out those same finches with those different beak patterns, they actually fluctuate. So they actually fluctuate based on on the abundance of their food source, and they've never gone on to become another species. In fact, the information for all of those beak types has been found within the DNA of all of the birds. It's like blue eyes. Okay, blue eyes are recessive traits, right? So if you have a dad who has brown eyes and you have a mom who has brown eyes, you can have a kid who has blue eyes. Okay, the genetic material is there. Okay, the genetic material for blue eyes was there in the mom and dad who have brown eyes.
So you're saying that the finch would develop the different style of bill depending on the food supply, meaning that finches without a strong enough bill would die out and the heavier billed ones would survive?
That's correct.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that it became another species. See, you got to understand, Darwin's theory was based on speciation. In other words, one species evolved into another more complex species. But that's never been shown. In fact, there have been scientists who have taken, because we obviously can't look at millions of generations of reptiles. But what we can look at is millions of generations of things like E. coli bacterial cultures. Why? Because they'll replicate 5 or 6 times in, an 8-hour period of time. So there are some scientists who have tried to create different bacterial species by monkeying with the DNA of E. coli, and they have yet to produce anything except E. coli. And they are like millions of replications later.
So you're saying that something like CRISPR, where you go in there and tinker with the DNA, you might produce something. You can't produce something that is a totally new species.
Right. For instance,
what
if you
define as a species?
Well, I mean that kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. So I mean,
my understanding as a species is that it can't interbreed with other species.
Correct. That's why, for instance, or if it interbreeds, that the offspring cannot then breed. Like a mule. Right, a horse and a donkey have an offspring. It's a mule. Mules are sterile.
Yeah. Okay, so your assertion is that all the species that we know of on the planet sprang forth at the same time?
My statement is that all the species on the planet were designed by God, not random chance.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Because you have to understand Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory was, and by the way, the reason it's called Darwin's Black Box, why Behe calls his book Darwin's Black Box, is because you have to understand the cell was the black box of biology at the time of Darwin. They thought all the cell was just a blob. They had no concept of DNA. They had no concept of organelles within a cell. They had no concept of what it even meant for DNA to mutate and become something else. They didn't even understand that DNA was there. They just thought that species kind of melded into something else. So they didn't understand any of that kind of stuff. And Darwin's theory was based on random small mutations from one generation to the next that then get held on to because those random chance mutations led to a survival advantage for the species.
Right. So, like at White Sands
Hmm.
in New Mexico, the mice are all white because the dark ones stand out against the white sand and get picked off by predators.
Right. But
But
understand, way
they
back
can,
in the day, right, there were black mice there. It's not that the
yep.
black mice mutated into white mice. The DNA was already there for white mice. It's just
And
the
they're
black
not a
mice.
separate species.
Right. They're not a different species.
Hmm.
Right. Right. They're not a different species at all.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks for clarifying that
Yeah.
because I always feel a little uncomfortable when somebody says, "Well, Darwin was wrong," because he wasn't about a lot of
Well,
those.
he wasn't wrong about a lot of things, but he was wrong about an enormous amount of things. I mean,
Well, he's just guessing.
right, exactly. And it's interesting actually because Darwin actually made the statement that if ever there was a discovery in see, he thought the fossil record was going to back up what he said. But it turns out the fossil record hasn't done that at all. In fact, the fossil record has actually refuted Darwin. There's something called the Cambrian,
The
huh?
theory of macro
The
evolution.
theory of macroevolution. But that's what. Remember, the title of his book was "On the Origin of Species." He thought that's how species came into being. Remember, right? So, so for Darwin, there's something called the Cambrian explosion, where when you look at the fossil record, uh, most, if not all, of the phylum that are present in the world today came into existence essentially in a snapshot in time. Okay? Well, that flies in the face of Darwinian evolutionary theory because, again, it was supposed to all be these gradual changes. And basically, phyla, by the way, is different body types. So all of a sudden, you went from these very simple things to essentially all of the current body types that we have in the world today in a snapshot in time. With no, he also posited that there would be what he called transitional forms. In other words, if it went from a worm to a lizard, just as an example, you'd see, well, maybe there was a worm that had 2 legs but not 4. Right? That's none of those have ever been found. In fact, I guarantee you there's a picture you've seen that's been used as a quote unquote transitional form, which has been completely debunked, and that's the Archaeopteryx. The Archaeopteryx is this creature that looks like a dinosaur, basically, like a lizard, but it has wings and it with feathers. Okay, and it's supposedly was a transitional form between lizards and birds. The problem is it's been dated to be after birds. There's not a transitional form at all.
I think I understand what you're saying. It's like, sure, uh, humans and have a lot of features in common with primates, but there's no halfway.
Right. Exactly. Not only that, sometimes atheists will say, well, the fact that the amoeba has the same kind of DNA as us is an indication of evolution. I would argue back to them, well, why? How do you come to that conclusion? Because I would come to the conclusion that again, let's go back to Bill Gates' statement that DNA, the language of DNA, is far greater than any computer program ever written. If it is that phenomenal, why wouldn't a creator God use it to create all life? Why reinvent the wheel for every type of life?
Well, but there's certainly fossil evidence that at one time on the planet there wasn't anything that looks like life today
Mm-hmm.
when there was only, amoebic life forms.
Correct.
Or so where did I mean, isn't that? I mean, we couldn't
The
reinvent
The
those.
Bible doesn't even say that God created everything at once, Helen.
I know, but so you're saying that different species came into being because of the creator, but not necessarily at the same instant.
I wasn't there, and neither were you, right? So, and that's exactly right, and that's the
Come
way,
on.
right? But I mean, again, even in the Bible, it doesn't say that He created all life in the same time at the same time at all. Um,
So, so what you're saying is that even though the earliest fossil records show nothing like any, I mean, there weren't any vertebrates,
mhm.
that their appearance later was just a matter of God's timing, not evolution, not my macro evolution.
That's what that is my take on it. Yes, there are others who believe in something called theistic evolution, which basically says that. Let me see if I can put it the way they put it. Basically, that God created life and guided the process of evolution through His power by intervening in the world. But I want to just read something for you for just a second. Let's see. I'm pulling up the verse right now. All right. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit-bearing trees, fruit in which there is seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which their seed, each according to his kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning the third day. And then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse." I'll skip forward. And God, and God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and everything living